Welcome to Eldrynth. Eldrynth is nothing, for now. The ultimate goal of Eldrynth is to be a story-driven, social city-building RPG. One that evokes an earlier era of RPG, such as Final Fantasy IV, V, and VI, the Trails Up series, the SNES and Game Boy Legend of Zeldas, Fire Emblem and Fire Emblem The Sacred Stones, and Stardew Valley. A lofty goal, I know, but I'm a man with an unrelenting vision, unfounded ambition, and no self-reserve or management skills. It means an RPG that focuses on building a fantasy city through social interaction, story elements, and monetary recruitment. The player sets out with a single house and a forest, and from there develops a town into an empire, all while cultivating its citizens for the purpose of production, popularity, and political sway. Key citizens will have jobs, such as blacksmiths to arm your soldiers, alchemists to produce potions, rune scribes to enchant your items, and a myriad of other possibilities. These citizens are persuaded to serve under your name and your banner through choices made in the main story, side and optional quests, recruitment through paying and offering jobs, as well as the popularity of your settlement to pull people in. In addition, I would like to promote various styles of play. Maybe you don't want to engage in combat, so you hire men to traverse the mines and slay monsters for materials and drops. Maybe you don't want to play the story, so you ignore the quest and build an empire out of money alone. Or maybe you want to live a simple life, in a single house without a town, and fish all day. Those are all viable options, and I want to cater to as many playstyles as possible. I take heavy inspiration from two sources, Stardew Valley and early Final Fantasy. I want to evoke the social aspects and management of Stardew Valley, and the looks and stories of Final Fantasy. Aside from those, I want to incorporate the dungeons, wacky items, narrative progression, and puzzles of 2D Zelda, and the combat and min-maxing of tactical RPGs, like Fire Emblem The Sacred Stones, Fire Emblem Three Houses, and the Trails Up series. In all, I hope to weave a stellar game from the threads of inspiration I've had from all the games that have had an impact on me. As specifics come up in my development, I'll be sure to mention what game I pulled them from. It all starts with Stardew Valley, a game I love dearly. I thought one day, several years ago, after playing the Tinker's Construct mod on Minecraft, what if I could make and sell armor and weapons like crops in Stardew Valley? What if I could min-max and micromanage the weapons and items I use in combat by making the items myself? That is where my first idea started. I moved on that idea and came close to a first product. I had a skeleton of mechanics and a story with a project named Blacksmith Saga. Much of the ideas from that game are being revamped and expanded on to keep from limiting the player to just blacksmithing and instead breaking the concept open to have a variety of options and playstyles. I decided to sacrifice the tedious nature and mechanics of blacksmithing to expand into more fantasy and management disciplines. I'm attempting to strike a balance between variety of production and the involvement required to make those products. The main graphics I use are the fantastic Tilesets of Finalbossblues. I purchased these Tilesets on itch.io and I've subscribed to his Patreon. I love the classic SNES era feel that they have, even though I wasn't alive for that part of video game history. I encourage you to check his stuff out, especially if you're interested in 2D game development with classic SNES-esque graphics. I will be adjusting and reworking assets to fit my vision and for what works best for my game. But they all start with what the asset makers provide, and I would not be able to realize my vision without their hard work. For now, all music will be classical music I personally arrange or compose myself. I do this to avoid copyright and so I can personally shape the sounds of my game instead of trying to shoehorn someone else's music into it. As a final note on assets, everything I used and remake for my game will always be linked in the description. Leave your questions and comments about this build in the comments below. If I see them before the next devlog is finished, I'll throw them into the Q&A at the beginning of the next one. First, I opened up the settings and adjusted them to match my project. This project will be for Windows because that's the Gamemaker Studio 2 desktop license I bought. Nothing crazy was changed here. I allowed full screen switching and turned off the cursor, as I'll be adding my own cursor first and foremost. I used the starting room to determine the size of my game. As you will see, this will change quite a bit before the end of the video. I initially set it to 480 by 320, but as I filled the rooms with tiles, that increased. More on that in the problems I encounter section of the video. You may notice as I go along, my sprites are based around a 16 by 16 grid. I upscale these to 32 by 32 so that I can make UI elements appear smaller when those are added in. I also like to edit the sprite at 16 by 16 and upscale by 200%, as you'll see when I begin to edit the images. When dealing with texture pages, this may change and I may code the upscale to avoid graphics problems, but for now I'll continue with this until it presents a problem. My views are important to me as well. They create a rectangle that I use to determine my room sizes. House interiors will more often than not be a single view. Smaller areas will be 2x2 views, and so on. That is how I personally came up with grounding my room sizes and not making ridiculous rooms that take forever to walk through. The DS grid I created is the crux of the game. Player movement and combat will need the grid, building placement and NPC movement will be around the grid, and everything else will reference the grid. Simply put, I made a grid based on the room width and height and created a blank object to represent each cell of the grid. These objects are stored in the DS grid and I can reference them later on, as you will see in the player movement section. To show the grid cells, I put a simple sprite that will show when a grid cell is being hovered over, as seen here. I also took this opportunity to create my first macro. Since my game is based around 32 by 32 cells and sprites, I made it my default size. If you see a dark red colored variable named space, that's my macro at work. I chose a night sprite for story related reasons. As I get closer to fleshing out a first chapter, it'll make more sense. Movement was inspired directly from early generation Pokemon and is similar to old school RPGs. Since I have a grid, I chose to have players move on that grid instead of having free movement like most other RPGs. I did this in an effort to make movement clear and provide a straightforward understanding of where a player is, can go, and what cells a player can interact with. This movement also makes collisions easier, as all I have to check for is whether a cell is occupied or not, instead of having to have objects collide into one another. The starting locations are based on the mainline story. I set out to make the main house serve a hub-like function similar to the farmhouse in Stardew Valley. Much the same, I created a first area like the farm for players to make and gather resources. My next planned expansion will be a path leading to town and 2 combat locations, a mine and a plains. Using the Time Fantasy tilesets, I adjusted them to compact the empty space between tiles. With what little I know about texture pages and sprites, I try to make the sheets as small as possible. Finalbossblues does a fantastic job organizing the tiles, and it became a balancing act between keeping the clear organization and minimizing empty tiles. As I continue to build the world, I'll expand the tileset sprites and add my own personal additions to fill in blank spaces. While making the starting house, I found the size of my initial 480 by 320 view to be too small. I increased it to make the starting house interior less cramped, and later on I made the house more square shaped instead of filling the full view. The starting forest area is a 2x2 view size. After my initial layout and a change in the room size, I went back and added more cliffs and water so that I could restrict the player movement a bit more naturally. The coding I added for movement acted bizarre, and after an extended time of coding it, I let it be and decided to come back and adjust it later. This can be seen when the player moves and the sprite lingers on the standing animation, causing a bit of a stutter step. Another problem I ran into was allowing the player to change the direction the sprite was facing without moving the object. My initial cooldown didn't work, as it created a loop that set the cooldown while the button was held, freezing the sprite in place until the button was released. Without the cooldown, the player object would move immediately after turning, so I tried to add time between for the player to be able to release the button and not move. Since I was coding the room switch, I decided to iron out the problems compiling on the movement system. This ended up being completely reworked, with this being the final product. I also took the time while I was focused on this to condense the code and cut out any unnecessary variables and lines. This took several attempts, but I eventually found a system that functioned how I wanted it to. It checks if the player is in a cell, then while the keyboard button is pressed, it checks the sprite. If the sprite is not facing the right way, it rotates and cools down. Then, when the step event passes with a 0 cooldown, the player will then move. Assigning the cooldown only when the sprite is facing the wrong way fixed the problem of the cooldown staying stagnant when the button is held. This gives the whole movement system the feeling and control I want. The first camera and viewport size problem started when I placed the player in the world, and noticed my horizontal cells were even and the player wasn't centered. I added 32 to it and moved on. I eventually settled on 800 by 448 with the starting house. This was so the game fills my 1080p monitor with no bars and full screen. I was split between the more classic 4:3 aspect ratio and the more modern 16:9 aspect ratio, but ultimately decided matching to the monitor would be the best looking option in the long run. After a third and hopefully final resolution change, I set up the starting areas and did some finishing touches, like adjusting depth so the player does not walk under the bridge, and I added a super spooky cave to be used in the next video. To finish up this build, I added code to the grid controller object that tracks where a player is in a room, and teleports the player to the correct room when on a cell that is meant to leave the room or area, such as doors. If you have any questions or comments, leave them down below. I don't claim to be a coding expert, and I'm continuing to learn. If you think something could be done in a better way, or if you see a potential bug or problem happening in the future, let me know. All comments will be read, but not all of them will be heeded or acknowledged. Watch this game grow. Stay tuned for more, and I'm excited to see you in the next one. BY, bye.